All right, this is a review of our camera workshop. So this is going to break down a few key things for you, including shutter speed, aperture, and then ISO. And we're going to go ahead and dive a little bit here, depending on how we get going. We may dive into white balance, and then we'll also talk a little bit about each of the cameras that you all have access to, which is the EOS M, which is the original model, and then they made an EOS M3. And so we'll talk about how you can see the differences between the two cameras, and then you can check out the manuals for both of those cameras so you can actually see how to use them because the settings are different in each camera. So it's a little bit tricky, making sure that you know which camera you have and then which one it matches up to in terms of the manual. So let's go ahead and dive into just some of our basic settings and how to use a camera, and then we'll tailor that specifically to the cameras that you all have access to through FT201. So to get started, just checking in to see who understands the term shutter speed, aperture, or ISO right off the bat. Some people may recognize one or two of these terms, but they don't necessarily feel comfortable explaining it or maybe even putting it into practice. And so our whole goal here is to make sure that we are comfortable and can put it into practice. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. A camera, right? So we're going to get to these three settings, but first we need to go backwards for a second and talk about cameras. All right, you can't see my mouse right now. Wish you could. We're going to talk about cameras. So to start off, a camera is a black box. So you can make a camera out of almost anything. It's just that you need four specific things. You need a black box. You are going to go ahead and need a lens, all right, which allows, it can even be just a pin prick in the side of a wall. For anyone who's ever made a pinhole camera, that pin prick actually acts as the lens that's shaping the light coming into the camera. If you had a giant hole in the side of your box, it's not going to act as a lens. It's just going to let in a lot of light. And so the lens is a highly scientific process, but you just need to know for right now that you're going to need one of those. The next thing you're going to need is a shutter. The shutter is what's going to establish the start and stop of your picture. So again, if you just had a black box with a lens, all you're basically making is essentially something like a telescope or binoculars, or what we also call a camera obscura, for anyone who knows what that is. All right, so the shutter is what's telling us the start and stop of our image. So it goes up and down, it opens and closes, all right, to start and stop our picture. And then the fourth thing you're going to need is a recording medium. So you're going to need some type of recording element in your camera. Back in the day, 35mm film used to be the main recording medium of choice for photographers. Now we use a digital sensor, and we'll talk a little bit more about that digital sensor. So what we're going to talk about, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, deal with all three of these things. The aperture is inside the lens. The shutter is going to control our shutter speed, and then the digital sensor actually is going to control our ISO, or our sensitivity to light. So these three elements inside our black box, that's what we're starting with here. Take a look at this picture, right? This photograph is what we would say really bright. Right? This image is overexposed. So the way that we can tell that is that there are not very many shadows. All the windows basically are blown out, and you have a lot of bright highlights. You don't have very much detail in this image. So keep that in mind. When we're talking about if a picture is well exposed, all right, we need to decide what that looks like. All right, and this image right here is overexposed. This image right here, right, it is underexposed, meaning that it is too dark. It means that there are too many shadows and not enough highlights. So this term that I'm using, exposure, all right, is what we're really talking about when we're talking about all these camera settings. We're trying to find this perfect exposure where we have a nice mixture of highlights, we have a nice mixture of shadows, and we also have a lot of gray tones in the middle. All right, so this right here is an example of proper exposure. So when we talk about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, we're trying to find a nice mixture and a nice balance to create an image that looks like this, something that is properly exposed. So those three settings fall into balance with one another. So you're picking and choosing, and we'll get into the actual settings here next. This is right here is called an exposure triangle. This is basically a representation of how all three of these settings are all intermixed. They all feed off one another. All right, so they're all in balance. So at the top, I have ISO. That controls the sensitivity of the sensor to light. So you can take that digital sensor that is filled with pixels and you can make it very sensitive to light. I call it kind of pumping in some steroids there to make sure that it is ultra sensitive to light. Your shutter speed. This down here controls your motion blur. So stopping and starting our picture, right, opening and closing that shutter, you're able to decide exactly what and how much action you want to capture in your scene. Say you're photographing somebody running. You may want just to photograph a split second when they are in motion, or you might want to capture them streaking across the screen, running across the screen, and get the blur of their whole body to show how quickly they're moving. So that's an artistic choice that you could make, and it's all a matter of being able to control the appearance of motion. And then down here in the lower right, we have aperture. And aperture is another artistic tool that controls how much physical distance is in focus. So it's the physical distance in front of the lens. So if you are photographing a series of objects lined up in a row and they're starting right in front of you and they recede back, they go backwards away from the camera. You could decide if you wanted to have all of those objects in focus or just one of those objects in focus. So these three settings here control, two of them control major artistic choices, and your ISO is kind of there to balance out what else, which one you want to make a priority here. So let's go ahead and dive into aperture to get started. So again, aperture controls physical distance that is in focus in front of the camera. Just to get a little technical here, the aperture is inside the lens. It is not in the camera, it is inside the lens. And the best correlation I can draw for you is that everyone in their eye has an aperture. Inside your eye, there's something called an iris, and it is the colored part of your eye. And what happens is, as you go about your day and you go in from a dark room or a bright room, your iris is going to constrict, meaning it gets smaller, or it will expand, meaning it gets bigger around your pupil. And what's happening is you are either letting in more light, right? It gets bigger, the hole gets bigger, you let in more light, or it gets smaller and it constricts and it lets in less light. So thinking about that, you all day long, when you go from a dark room into a bright space, it's very bright at first and your eyes take a minute to adjust. What's happening is your muscle in your eye is shrinking down to block out all that new light. Same thing is what happens if you go from a dark space or a bright space into a dark room. Your muscle in your eye needs to relax to let in more light, right? To soak up whatever light is available. So that's the best correlation I can draw for you. Okay. Now remembering this, I want to use this in very basic terms here. Aperture controls how much physical distance is in focus. In the top images here where it says f1.4, right in the middle on the top, that barely has a tick mark in focus, compared to if you go all the way down to the lower right, which says f16, most of that tape measure is actually in focus, and you can almost make out the details in the recliner in the chair behind the tape measure. So, these are the terms that we use to talk about that physical distance. In the top, if we have very little physical distance in focus, it's called shallow depth of field. If you have a lot of the room in focus and everything is in focus, that means you have a large depth of field. So that's how we decipher the difference. So if you're talking about a photograph that has very little in focus, we are talking about shallow depth of field. Again, if you have a photograph that has a lot in focus, great physical distance, that is called large depth of field. And those are how you delineate the difference. Okay, so we talked about this example about Citizen Kane, where there is a boy in the background, there is a man in the kind of middle ground, and then we have this mother and this businessman in the foreground. And all these elements are crisp and clear in focus, so we are actually using very large depth of field here. And this is a specific choice that Orson Welles made to use f/22 or f/16. It most likely is f/22 as that was brand new technology at the time. All right, so recapping for you, we have at the top, we have an example of how you have very shallow depth of field. The tree in the background is out of focus. The bunny in the foreground is out of focus. In the middle, you're right, you can expand. You don't have to go one or the other. You can have variation and choose a number in the middle. So f5.6, all right, that you could make a choice to have, a few feet in focus. And then f/22 you would be able to have, or anything kind of above f/16, f/11, a lot of that scene would be in focus. Okay, so here's the official scale for you. All right, so if you are good with numbers, this is probably going to be really easy for you to memorize. For those of you who are not as good with numbers, I can give you some strategies here. All right, but first let's go ahead and take a look. To connect this to what we've already been talking about, we have off to the left here, we have f1.4. Looks like a comma, but it's actually a period. f1.4 has this very wide open aperture, very large circle. And if you look at the corresponding graphic above, we just see that person in focus and everything behind them is basically mush. Then you move over to the next setting and it says f2, right? It stands for focal stop 2, right? If you look at that, the mountains in the background are a little bit clearer. You go one step over, f2.8 we get clearer, f4 we get clearer, f5 we get clearer, f8, and so on. And what you can tell is that the size of our aperture opening is actually getting smaller and smaller as we go down. So what you need to remember is the wider the aperture opening, the bigger the aperture opening, right? The less that will be in focus. All right, so this is how I like to do this. So if you look at f1.4, this is not scientific, so please do not challenge me on the science of this and the math of this. But if you take f1.4, I like to think of it as 1.4 inches will be in focus. A very small section of distance will be in focus. Comparatively, if you go all the way down to the other end with f/22, you have f/22, you have a very small little aperture opening, right? f/22, what you need to remember is essentially what that means is 22 feet of distance will be in focus. All right, so it's trying to remember the number is a bigger number, more distance. Smaller number, small distance, all right? So trying to wrap your head around this. Again, for those of you who are not fantastic at math, go ahead and this is your scheme for remembering. What happens when you are choosing your aperture or your f-stop number is you are deciding exactly how much light is going to enter the lens, and this is a scientific process. So if you go from having f1.4 to f2, you are decreasing the amount of light by half. If you go from f2 to f2.8, you are decreasing the light again by half. Again, 2.8 to 4, you're cutting it in half. 4 to 5.6, you're cutting it in half. All right, the same thing goes in reverse. If you are going from f/22 and you open your aperture up to f/16, you are essentially doubling the amount of available light. If you go from f/16 to f/11, you are doubling that amount of light. So you need to remember that as you move along this scale, you are either increasing or decreasing the available amount of light, and it's either being cut in half or it is doubling. All right, so play that back if that's confusing. All right, and the way that you can remember this scale is simply the fact that the numbers double. So 1.4 times 2 is 2.8. 2.8 times 2 is 5.6. 5.6 times 2 is not quite f/11, but it's close. And then 11 times 2 is 16. It works a little better when you go down below. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 2 is 16, and so on. So the numbers double as you go. All right, so that's your scheme for how to try and remember. Now, this is a really complicated idea for some people in FT201, so I'm just going to give it to you, and if it is overwhelming, don't worry, you don't have to digest it. What's happening inside your actual lens is you have all this glass, and from the left side you have all these light rays that are entering your lens. And what happens is the lens is going to bend and shape your light so that everything coming in will fall into focus on that digital sensor. All right, so that's really what's happening. Now, when you have your aperture opening wide open, what happens is you can notice in this convex and concave glass is that the light that's being bent from the top or the bottom of the lens, right, those high up, they get bent the most. And what ends up happening is that you can't necessarily get them to all fall into line on that film plane or on that digital sensor that's all the way to the right. So when you shoot at f/22, it's basically like saying that middle arrow only is shooting straight through the straight parts of the lens, and it's all going to come into focus at the same time on the same film plane. But again, when you have that really wide open aperture, what's happening is the light coming in at the top and at the bottom of your lens is getting bent, and it does not end up coming into line on your film plane at the exact, or your digital sensor at the exact same time, and that is what actually creates this really cool shallow depth of field. All right, so shallow depth of field here, we have a bee. All you're able to see is the antenna of the bee and just its rear legs, and then you have Serena Williams here, so you can see her shoulders are even blurred. So this is shallow depth of field, all right, compared to what we were using a minute ago, right, which Citizen Kane, this is large depth of field. So here we're probably using f/22, a great distance is in focus. And then if we go forward here to our shallow depth of field, we're probably using, for the B, we're probably using an f/1.4. For Serena Williams, we're probably using an f/2.8, something in that range. All right, so it's just a matter of getting comfortable with the artistic choice that each setting will provide you. All right, so let's move into shutter speed. So shutter speed controls motion blur, and we talked a little bit about this. I want to give you some backstory. Now, back in the day, early film history, this daguerreotype right here is one of the first film cameras that was ever invented. And this camera was created by two photographers and chemists around the late 1830s. All right. Now, these cameras had very long exposure times because film was brand new. All right, and they didn't have very sensitive chemicals to spread onto that film. So the exposure times were actually very, very long. All right. So this is a picture of a young Abraham Lincoln, and he is sitting for a portrait, and they're using that daguerreotype camera with him. Right. Now, an exposure time for the daguerreotype in a room like this, right, is probably about 20 to 30 minutes, I'm being fully honest with you. All right, so he cannot hold still without moving for that long of a period of time. So what they ended up doing was creating a chair that actually was hidden, and it helped to provide support to the neck for anyone being photographed. Now, this is something that is kind of an extreme measure. We don't have exposure times this long for portraits anymore. Our technology has advanced exponentially. So now we can take a portrait of a person in mid-air. They could be moving around or jumping around and getting action shots, and we can now freeze their action. So this is older technology, and that's again because that sensor, that film inside the camera, was not particularly sensitive. So here's what's happening inside the camera right in the 21st century, and I just want to check really fast. All right, so here we go. All right, here's what's happening in all of our digital cameras today. We have inside the camera, if you remove the lens, which I do not encourage you to do, but if you remove the lens, you can actually see this shutter mechanism that is exposed. So these are all these different little blades, and they're going to open and then they are going to close, and that is going to establish the start and stop of your picture. So I'm showing you a really fast shutter speed here, 1/1000. So what actually happens at 1/1000 is these shutter blades are going to sweep up, and then that is going to be the picture. So go ahead and take a look here. So that's it really fast. All right. And if we go back, it's going to go ahead and play it in slow motion. So here's what's actually happening. All right. See that the shutter is going up and then it's going down. So that is how a picture is taken in the 21st century. all right? So this is what that is able to capture. So if you have a really fast shutter speed, right, you are able to freeze action. You're only taking a slice out of whatever perceived motion you're seeing. So for example, this is extreme, but if you have a speeding bullet, right, the human eye cannot see a speeding bullet. All right, so these photographers had to figure out a shutter speed that would be fast enough to freeze this bullet mid-air. You can tell that this is really fast because the card hasn't even fallen yet. Those shards of the card are still in mid-air. So what shutter speed they probably used here is probably 1/8,000, maybe even faster than that. That's how quick our technology is able to get. Now, to go at a fast shutter speed, you can only imagine how much light is being pumped at this card. And we'll get into the details of bringing back in that idea of exposure, having it be really bright or really dark, and we'll get into that. All right, so let's just get the mechanics of the artistic ability of each of these settings first. So if we're talking about a shutter speed this quick, and it, something around 1/4,000, 1/8,000, and it's able to freeze our action, we can actually then slow our shutter speed down to capture a great deal of movement. So this is an example of a completely dark room where they brought in maybe glow sticks or glowing lights and they swung them around. And they were able to create some pretty cool patterns. Now, because of how many swirls there are here, I would bet you this is probably at least 30 seconds worth of swirling. So the shutter speed here is probably open for 30 seconds and then it closes. So what happens is that neon light is marking the sensor. It's almost drawing on the sensor at every point that it is lit up. And it creates this really cool effect. So this is a really slow shutter speed. You could set your shutter speed to 1 second, 2 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, or you can leave it open indefinitely as long as you're holding down the shutter. You can set it to something called bulb. And that bulb setting will allow you to have the shutter door open as long as you're holding down that shutter button. All right, so here are some direct comparisons you can see. If you have a fast shutter speed, which is represented in the upper left-hand corner here, you have a crisp, definite, you can see every little water droplet. Okay, that's 1/1,000. As you slow down here and you go over to 1/125, 1/25, and then 1/15, look at the difference in the one on the lower right, which is 1/15. I'm sorry. You can actually see the streak of the water droplet. So what's happening is the molecule of water is falling faster than the camera shutter can open and close. At the shutter speed 1/1000 in the upper left-hand corner, the shutter is opening and closing and is freezing that molecule in place. Going back down to the lower right corner, the molecules actually have time to streak and spread, which is really cool because you can actually use this and create some type of effect like this, where you are able to leave the shutter open for an extended period of time. The camera has to be locked down on a tripod though, but this shot was the camera was probably left open for at least 30 seconds, maybe even a couple minutes because of how smooth that water is. Now, a lot of students ask me, how is it that the rocks are holding in place? Why are the mountains holding in place but the water is streaking? Well, the reason is because you have a tripod holding up your camera and everything is stationary. Everything is getting imprinted on the sensor in crazy detail wherever it is holding still. When that water molecule enters the right-hand side of the frame and it streaks across and is going, or left-hand side, I'm not sure which direction the water is flowing here. When it enters the frame and it streaks across, it's drawing a line, just like our example from before here. It's drawing that line and that's what's able to create this really cool effect. Right, so this is a very slow shutter speed. And the only reason you know that is because the water is blurred. The only reason this works is because they had a tripod. Right, so let's look at the actual shutter speed scale here, which is to say that you can have a fast shutter speed on the right-hand side, which stops and it has very crisp action. Right, so if you were photographing an athlete or a small child jumping or running, I would capture them around 1/1000th of a second. If you are trying to blur or streak or create this really cool sense of motion, I would use a slower shutter speed, maybe 1/4 of a second or a whole second to leave that shutter open. Now, here are the compromises though. A fast shutter speed on the right hand side, you can read this list. It allows in less light. It means that you have a shorter exposure so you don't have any blur. It freezes the action. And a really cool thing is you can actually hand hold your camera, so you actually don't need a tripod. Right? And on the right hand or the left hand side, you have a slow shutter speed, which here are the drawbacks, the reality of it. It allows in a lot more light. So your picture is going to be very bright, possibly overexposed. So it allows you to take long exposures, maybe a minute or 2 minutes, creates this really cool motion blur. However, the downside is if you're hand holding, you're going to shake and you're going to move and you're going to blur the whole picture and it won't turn out the way you want it to. So you have to have that tripod. Now, last little piece here is to talk about the reality of light. So the first thing on here that it says is allows in less light or it allows in more light. Now, fast shutter speed, you're going to have very dark exposure. You're going to probably be underexposed. Really long shutter speed off to the left-hand side here, maybe 1 second. That's going to be very bright, probably overexposed. All right, so it's a matter of trying to decide what you are wanting to do with your artistic choice, and then trying to make that compromise with aperture, and then what we're about to talk about is ISO. We talked about this picture briefly. The idea here, we are in a dark elevator. We have a girl who is the elevator attendant. She's pushing all those buttons, and the people around her are in motion. So this shutter speed, she's locked in place, but the people who are walking are blurred slightly. So this shutter speed is probably in that mid-range, right? This is probably handheld. It's someone in the elevator. It's Robert Frank as he's, running and gunning. So he's probably holding still. She's probably holding still. But these people are in motion. And so he was probably able to use a shutter speed of maybe around 1/30, maybe 1/60. And he's able to capture this really cool effect where people who are walking get blurred, but everyone else is stationary. And he can still hand hold that. Here's a modern day version of this same idea, which is you have a woman standing in the doorway of this train, and she is off to the left, and she is holding still, so she is frozen in place. Everyone else, though, who's moving slightly, they are blurred. So the shutter speed here is still in that same kind of range, right? The effect on the people is still essentially the same. So we have a person who is, walking pretty quickly and they're really blurred, and then we have people who are just kind of standing there in the background looking and they're not blurred. So you're probably still in that 1/30, maybe 1/15 category. So it's actually not that fast of a shutter speed. So let's talk about how ISO plays into this. And I want to make sure that you're not saying ISO, but that you are instead saying ISO. ISO stands for International Standards Organization. And you don't need to know all the details about ISO, but the gist of it is that when film cameras were first being developed, they were being developed all over the world. And photographers would travel from one country to another, and there was no standard for what film stock they could buy. So they would go and they would buy a film stock, and then they would try to put it into their camera and set their camera to that film stock, and it would have they wouldn't be able to dial it in. So all the countries basically got together and decided that they would have one international standard for film stocks, and that is kind of where we moved on from there. So we translate this ISO setting today to the digital world, where we have digital sensors, and we've kept in that same mathematic equation the ISO numbers for sensitivity, but the technology is totally different. So let's take a look. Back in the day, little history again, back in the day we used to have film stock, which was a piece of plastic, basically, flexible plastic, that was coated and painted in these silver halide crystals. Now these silver halide crystals were light sensitive, which is why you could not show film to the light. You couldn't put it out there. And so by having the silver halide crystals on this film and sealed up inside that black box of a camera, every time the shutter opens and closes, you're actually imprinting light into these silver halide crystals. So it's actually a really cool chemistry experiment. So if anyone's really into science, this is something you might be really into. All right, so again, getting quickly into the digital version, and bridging the gap here, film stocks used to be rated in terms of their sensitivity. So all these crystals that are painted on top of your plastic base, those crystals would either be very sensitive to light or not very sensitive to light. And you could get them in a range. So ISO 100 is not very sensitive to light. That's kind of your base model. You can film and photograph outside and no worries. You know, the camera's not going to get overwhelmed. It's not going to be overexposed. ISO 100 is a very relaxed film format. Same with ISO 200. Now you start to get more and more sensitive as you move up the scale. So ISO 3200 is actually very sensitive film. So in terms of those silver halide crystals, those crystals would be really, really big. They had to make really big crystals that all kind of combined together to make them more sensitive to soak up any available light that was possible. So I'll give you a little cheat sheet later on as we go, but I want to make sure to clarify ISO 100 and 200, you're good to go to shoot outside. For ISO 400 and 800, you are good to go to shoot indoors. And then ISO 1600 and 3200, and it even goes up to 6400. On the cameras that you all are using in class, kind of basic entry-level cameras, honestly, I don't think that you should be shooting at 1600 and 3200. Just my opinion. So, you know, go with what I had explained. 100 to 200 for outdoors, bright sunlight, and 400 and 800 if you are indoors, not great available light. If you have really poor lighting conditions, you can shoot at 1600. If you really have to capture the photograph, but you aren't really worried about the quality of it, go ahead and shoot at 32. And in my opinion, don't shoot at 64 at all. So here's the new technology, how it all translates. So inside our cameras, we now have a single digital sensor. And you saw that actually in the shutter speed demo, that video that I showed you where the blades shoot down. You could actually see a glimpse of this sensor, and the sensor is actually covered with millions of pixels, millions and millions of pixels. And what a pixel is, it is a light sensitive electron basically. It's a little light sensitive photon, and what happens is it soaks in all the light coming in from the sun or whatever lights you have in your image or in your studio setup, and it transmits that light and color information in a digital signal, right? So that's what's happening, is these photons and electrons are getting converted. And they are all that information is being sent, and it's packaged in this little picture file that's called a JPEG. So you don't need to know the details of this just yet, but if you're interested in looking into it, there are two different, right, there are mainly two different types of sensors on the market right now. And one is the CCD sensor, which is a charged coupled device sensor. The way that sensor works is every little pixel soaks in its light energy, and then it pumps it all to one master control. So, you know, everyone's sharing their light information with another motherboard. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, kind of a more common digital sensor that you would see in maybe amateur and professional cameras today is the CMOS sensor, which is a complementary metal oxide semiconductor. And the way that that works is you have all these little pixels that actually can do all the processing of all that light and all the energy right at the actual pixel level. And then it funnels that final information out to make that JPEG. So just a little bit of sensor information for you, okay? But you just need to know that there is a digital sensor in the back of your camera, and all that light is coming into focus on that digital sensor, and that's what's making your picture. Right? So here is the digital version for you. So you can actually see ISO 100, same coming from those film stocks. ISO 100 is actually very clear. It's a very clean image. ISO 3200, very noisy. You have a lot of digital grain, a lot of digital noise. All right, so looking at the difference, I often think of this as a reference in terms of you're trying to pump up your pixels to be more sensitive to light. So ISO 100, those are very clean pixels. You have plenty of light coming in. ISO 3200, you are pumping in all these steroids. You're trying to get in all this extra juice to make sure that they're soaking up all this light. And it gets really junky. It doesn't look like a very healthy picture. So you have to think of it in terms of how much it's, how hard it's working to soak up all that light. So here's the scale again for you. It gets progressively more noisy as you move up the scale, 100, 200, 400. 800 is really when you start to see some of that noise. 1600 definitely, and 3200 you can't get away from it. Okay, so here's an example that sometimes I get questions about, which is how do sports photographers, how do they manage? Because what we're talking about is we're talking about aperture, where you could have a really bright image or really dark image. You have shutter speed, where you could have a really bright image or really dark image. And then ISO, you could have a really bright image or a really dark image. And so what I like to explain here is, if you look down to the lower right-hand side, I kind of break it down for you what the actual settings probably are here. So if we were to go ahead and do artistically what's happening, the photographer has chosen to have almost everything in the picture in focus. We can't really see some of the details and the people sitting around, but we can at least tell that there are people back there and that they're individual objects as opposed to one big blur. So we can take a pretty good guess. This is at least aperture setting of f11, maybe f16, possibly f22. But again, remember, you're cutting out a lot of light. So if you are shooting at f22, that picture is going to be really dark. All right, so we don't really have that luxury here. So we're probably going to go ahead and let in probably a f11, letting in a good amount of light. Now, the other thing you need to notice is artistically is that this basketball player is frozen in place. Nothing is moving, nothing is blurred. So you automatically know you need to have a very fast shutter speed in order to catch this guy who is flying through the air and to freeze him in place. So those two things automatically tell you you don't have very much light coming in. So you are going to have a very underexposed or very dark image. So what you need to do to compromise is you need to have a higher ISO setting. You need to make sure that that sensor is soaking up any available light that is there. And again, the question I often get as follow-up is, why doesn't this picture look noisy? Why isn't there a lot of grain? And the answer is because this is a professional quality camera. And the more expensive your camera, for example, $5,000, $7,000, something in that range, maybe even $2,500 today, the prices are coming down lower, you can actually buy a camera that has a higher ISO acceptability rate, meaning that you can actually shoot at 1600 and it actually looks really good. You might even be able to shoot at 6400 and you wouldn't even notice. All right, so the only reason I'm having you shy away from those higher ISO numbers to start off is because the camera you're using as a part of our program does not go that high and look good. All right, so that is a compromise that we're making here. You need to increase your ISO setting in order to let in enough light to balance this out. And that's how we get back to that exposure triangle. All right. So here's a quick start guide for you. We always want to shoot in manual mode, which we will go over when it comes to the actual camera we are using. Basic shutter speeds you might be able to start out with is, if you are using and shooting portraits, you could shoot at 1/60th of a second. If you were out on the street taking pictures of some people walking, moving, cars driving by, you could start out shooting around 1/125th of a second, right, getting a little bit faster. And then if you were photographing sports or kids moving or anyone running or some type of athletic activity, you have to be photographing with a shutter speed that's faster than 1/500th of a second. Again, we've talked a lot about 1/1000th of a second, and you don't have to blast off. A lot of people say, oh, I have to shoot at 1/4000. That's crazy. You don't need to photograph that fast. You're losing so much light. You're losing 5 times as much light, 4 times as much light. You don't need to do that. So find the shutter speed that matches the action you're trying to freeze and settle in there. That's totally fine. So it takes a little bit of more work, all right? When it comes to aperture, we are going to go ahead and set our aperture as low as it can go for right now. On some of these cameras that we have available, the lowest aperture setting might be f4. Sometimes it might even be f5.6. You were just trying to let in as much light as possible right now because you don't really have access to lighting equipment. Once you get access to lighting equipment, you can go ahead and start shooting with a higher aperture, maybe around f8, maybe f11, something like that. But for now, we are going to go ahead and stick with as low as it goes, only because we're trying to let in enough light so that you can make some really artistic choices with your shutter speed. And then, rule of thumb, ISO, if you have ISO 100 or 200, you can go ahead and shoot outdoors. Bright sunlight, maybe even on a cloudy day, you should be all right. Lots of available light. So if you're in a studio where you have a ton of light, or in your room where you're shooting has a lot of light, then go ahead and use ISO 200, fine. But know that most often when you're indoors, you need to be using ISO 400 or 800 in order to properly expose your image and make sure that it has plenty of light coming in. So I will send this out or have it available to you. You can take a photograph of it or a screenshot of it now and save it for yourselves. All right, so this is actually a really cool tool. We'll go ahead and go into it really quick. We'll go into Oh, right here. We'll go into this, which has it's basically a simulator. So you can go ahead and simulate anything you want in terms of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. You can even change the image. So if you were taking a picture of, let's see if I can click on these. Oh, it might actually make me go through them all. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. The shutter speed is going to matter in order to freeze this spinning wheel, all right? And we can decide if we want to have the Jack in the Box in focus or these pencils in focus. I'm going to go ahead and set this as low as it goes. I'm just going to have the pinwheel in focus, right? And I'm going to go ahead and set my shutter speed at 1/4000. Now it is going to give me a setting to say, all right, that's going to be really dark. All right, I can actually choose a range in here. Let's not spinning too fast. So now all of a sudden my picture is going to be really bright. So as you change your shutter speed, it actually is going to tell you, good exposure, overexposed. So I'm going to go ahead and change this from 1600 down. I want to shoot at 400 if I can. It's indoor lighting, all right, and I can actually slow this down, like I said, to maybe 1/250th. And I'm going to go ahead and take a picture. So the shutter speed isn't quite fast enough. I'm going to go ahead and throw that away. I don't like it. Let's go ahead and speed up our shutter and see what it wants. So let's go ahead. We're going to have to increase our ISO just a little bit to balance it out. Again, if you go a little higher, it gets too bright and then too bright again. So this allows you to kind of figure out where you are at. Let's go ahead and take a picture. Right, and our shutter speed is almost fast enough. So I think they're really trying to prove a point here. So let's go ahead and go all the way up to 4000. It's going to be really dark. We're going to have to compromise 6400. I never liked that. And now we are crisp and locked in. All right, so I think that although the wheel is not spinning that fast, I think they're giving us the impression that it actually, they're giving us false idea here. All right, so you can actually speed up. I think we can actually speed up or slow down some of that motion, and then it will keep all the shots down here when you're done. So we go ahead and take a picture. Right, all the settings are really off. You can see that that is overexposed, right? And now it's going to tell me very overexposed things I'm working on. I've got slow motion, shallow depth of field. So this is a really great resource, and this is just Canon Play. So if you don't know how to find this, Canon Play, right? And it should pop up. All right, so let's see what this does, and the simulator should be here, right? So there you are. All right, I'm going to go ahead and save our white balance discussion for a second video here, and we'll go ahead and dive into the color temperature and then the actual camera at another point. So I will dive into that next. All right, if you have any questions, please let me know.